Give it just one more minute while the last few people sign in before we call the meeting to order. Okay, it's my pleasure to call the University Senate to order. Hello, everybody. Our first item is a motion to approve a special rule limiting each speaker to 2 minutes each time they're recognized. A 2/3 majority of those present and voting is required to approve the special rule. No need for a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, Chris, if you could initiate the poll.
You give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 107 ayes, 3 nays, and 2 abstentions, that motion prevails.
Okay, thank you. The next item concerns administrative responses to the University Senate actions and is presented for information. There are no responses pending. Our next item is a list of recent faculty, staff, and student deaths that have been forwarded for announcement to the Senate. I invite you to observe a moment of silence while I share these names with you. Clark Alslaben, Stephen Houck, Young Ho, James Scoville, Pierre-Francois Vander Mortel, and Brent Wold. Thank you. Our next item is approval of the minutes from the University Senate meeting on November 3rd. No motion or second needed. So Chris, if you could please initiate the poll.
Give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 117 ayes, 0 nays, and 8 abstentions, that motion prevails.
Okay, thank you. The next item is the president's report. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 3rd University Senate meeting of this academic year. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you last time, and very unusually, neither could the provost. So I'm thinking I'll give twice as long of a report today to make up for lost time, or I'll just give you the regular report and I'll look forward to your questions at the end. So I'll also say that today is National Eat a Red Apple Day, which feels very University of Minnesota to me. So I hope everyone will enjoy an apple on National Eat a Red Apple Day. It's also the first day of December, and here we are swinging around towards the end of the fall semester, which is unbelievable. And I'm wishing everyone the best. I know this can be a very depleting sprint to the finish line, and I hope everyone is holding up okay. I also want to note and express gratitude because we are at this point 2/3 of the way through our 5-year strategic plan, MPACT 2025. And we've been working very hard on all of the deliverables of that plan, also gracefully pivoting as the circumstances allowed. It was never meant to be dogmatic, but rather a structure and an architecture for our leadership, but also with absolute capacity and room for moments that weren't anticipated when it was crafted, like global pandemics, like calls for strong action in social justice, like new partnership opportunities, et cetera. We've done well under this plan. I encourage you to check out the website or to look at the annual report that we'll be presenting to the Board of Regents next week, which shows really strong research, really strong philanthropy, improvement in our graduation rates, improvement in the reduction of student debt. Startups are up, patents are up. We've welcomed the most diverse incoming class in our history, and several other benchmarks that we think you would like to see if you're so inclined. We also launched over the course of this strategic plan, PRISM, President's Initiative on Student Mental Health. We've doubled down on PIPSM, President's Initiative for the Prevention of Sexual Misconduct. And we also did some things that we weren't expecting, but that were inspired by what we learned during the pandemic, like the launch of the Next Gen platform, which is a proprietary Google platform that combines distributed learning and applied experiences in focused collaboration to allow students to work while pursuing their degree and graduate faster and with work experience. So we launched Next Gen Med this fall, which is a partnership with the Rochester campus, the Mayo Clinic, and Google through this platform. Last month, we launched Next Gen Ag, which is partnership with Crookston and CFANS using the Google platform in partnership with multiple employers. We also saw the university move into the top 25 amongst publics in the US News rankings. Rankings are quite a subject. We may talk about that during the Q&A. But when they're good, we talk about why they're good. And when they're not good or they're troubling, we might talk about that too. But that was good news and something that we're delighted to see. There's a variety of other benchmarks notable under the strategic plan that we measure and make available. We actually, one more that I want to talk about before I move on to the next topic. On research.com, the university ranked number 20 globally and number 16 nationally. We just got this one a couple of days ago, and second in the Big Ten behind Michigan, based on our H index and D index scores. So that's a relatively new ranking from what I understand, all objective, publicly available data. We like those too, and we're doing quite well on that one. So a lot of our time this fall, energy concern has evolved around public safety. On campus, on our literal campus, the incidence of crime is flat and has been for many years and very low, not zero, but very low. In the adjacent neighborhoods, I think everyone is aware that we are experiencing some pretty significant challenges that on the whole are improving, but in the moment may not feel that way. And we're very aware of that too. We're also very aware of our commitments under MSAFE and a lot of really tremendous work by this campus in thinking about how we respond to emergencies and crime in ways that reflect that our lived experience leads to very different definitions of what it means to feel safe, and navigating with some challenge, as you might imagine, the coexistence of these two facts, these two realities. So recently, we've made several strategic investments to improve the likelihood or mitigate the likelihood of crime in the adjacent neighborhoods. We've hired community service officers and renewed our contract with Block by Block, which is a third-party vendor for safety ambassadors, Thursday through Saturday in Dinkytown. We've increased Gopher Chauffeur. We have 624 Walk and the Rave Guardian app. We've improved lighting in the adjacent neighborhoods and have requested funding from the city and will, in all likelihood, pending board approval from the state in our capital request for improved lighting in Dinkytown and Marcy Homes and other sort of technical solutions, in addition to staffing up UMPD to the levels that were budgeted for. We, like many law enforcement entities, lost some of our officers to retirements and transfers, et cetera. Recently, particularly at the end of October, we saw, after several very quiet weeks, an unexpected and very unpleasant spike in off-campus crime, and in particular, the use of fireworks, weaponizing fireworks. I'm sure you heard about this, very similar to what happened in the North Loop on New Year's Eve, happened here on Halloween. And so for the next 2 weekends, we had a special initiative called Gopher Guardian, where we had all of our officers, literally all of our officers on patrol, and paid MPD for 10 officers on triple overtime to patrol Minneapolis. So that's not a sustainable long-term solution, but we are trying to make sure that we have sufficient coverage when we know that things are heating up in our adjacent neighborhoods and are making the investments to do so. It's challenging not only because responding to crime is inherently challenging, but also because these neighborhoods are not our jurisdiction, but MPD is down, depending on the measures that you look to, hundreds of officers, a third by some accounts in their availability of officers. And we also have challenges because some of the best techniques to respond to upticks in crime might trigger some of the realizations we had through the MSAFE process. They also may negatively affect the business owners who are members of the Dinkytown Business Association. We have very strong feelings across the spectrum on this subject. And so we are working to strike a balance in all of that. Our police officers have been working overtime for about 2 years straight now. They are working really hard to make sure our community is safe in every way that we would define that term. They've been tremendous partners in everything we've been doing, including participating with great vulnerability in the MSAFE process. So we're very grateful to them. And we're optimistic about new leadership at MPD and what that can mean for their staffing and our partnership there too. In addition to our focus on public safety, safety also, of course, includes the health and well-being of our community. And the COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve. The Health Emergency Response Office, which we call HERO because everything gets a cute name or an acronym, that's appears to be required. And Jacob Toller, our Dean of the Medical School, but also our campus public health officer, are continuing to adapt each semester. We have paused the Emergency Management Policy Committee because we do not consider ourselves to any longer be in an emergency. We made that decision essentially concurrently with the governor removing the state of emergency, the state of Minnesota, but we will continue to use consultation and shared governance as decisions need to be made, and make sure that we're transparent and communicating about if and when there are changes. Still using lots of mitigation strategies, still have the availability of testing, and still lots of information available around this. And then also the other things that we're heading into flu season. We know there's an uptick in RSV, et cetera. All information available on the HERO website. We also welcomed several members of our university leadership team. Dr. Shashank Priya joined us as our VPR on September 30th. We formally launched the search for the Morris Chancellor. I went up there a few days ago for listening sessions formally for the search, but as you might imagine, we talked about lots of things while I was there, and we can talk about that in Q&A if anyone would like to. I want to particularly thank the Acting Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Dean Pei-Eng up at Morris, and our College of Education and Human Development Dean, Michael Rodriguez, who's an alum of the Morris campus, for co-chairing this search. It's going to be a really important search, as you might imagine, and we're very grateful to them and all the members of the search committee and the Morris community as a whole. Last week, Senior Vice President for Finance and Operations, Myron Franz, launched the search for our next VP for University Services. I want to thank that search committee too, and our co-chairs, Laura Molgard, who's the Dean of the Vet School, and Bernie Kalacek, who's the VP for IT and our Chief Information Officer. They'll co-chair that search. And I'd like to thank Matt Kramer, who is our Vice President for University Relations, but he's also been the interim VP for University Services. And as you've probably seen from your email, he has been very busy since taking on that role. Other things that I want to update you on: university history. So as a reminder, in February, the Board of Regents approved the university's new namings and renamings policy. This policy includes, a 75-year sunset provision for honorary namings, which seeks to acknowledge the historical significance of each naming, make sure that we are in modern times educated on who was honored, but also allow us the opportunity to reflect the evolving landscape of the university's past, present, and future achievements. So the university's All University Honors Committee system-wide representative shared governance committee established a working group and then created criteria. I want to give them a lot of thanks now and in anticipation of the work that they have coming. We have a lot of buildings across the system that are more than 75 years old. So they will be working through that backlog for several years, actually, and started with the 4 oldest buildings across the system: Falwell Hall and Sanford Hall on the Twin Cities campus, Keel Hall in Crookston, and Spooner Hall in Morris. This group of 4 was decided by the All University Honors Committee and was intended to be chosen in fairness as the oldest buildings, and also that number of buildings so that we could navigate capacity issues. As a community, we need to learn this process. There's no playbook for this other than a policy that is brand new. And so we know we will learn a lot this year going through this process. And not all of that learning will be easy. And so we wanted to make sure we had the capacity to address the various and sundry lessons that would come along. So as this group knows, we announced November 11th as the deadline for submissions for retention and or renamings requests. And obviously that deadline has passed. The All Universities Honors Committee will now begin deliberating to either confirm the retention of or their recommendation for the retention of or renaming of these 4 buildings. And that process will take until the end of the academic year and will eventually work its way to the board, who is the final authority on what our buildings are named. I want to very much extend my appreciation to the All University Honors Committee, who is doing a lot more than probably what they anticipated when they signed up for that committee, and in particular, Chair Tim Johnson, who's taking the lead really masterfully in this important work. Another area where we've been working very hard this fall that I want to discuss and I'm sure take questions on later is PEAK. So just as a reminder, we've been talking about PEAK for a really long time, but just to kind of get back to a level set. The reason we're doing PEAK is because we know that we need to continuously improve the way in which we provide administrative services. It's reflected in the strategic plan that we needed to do that. And PEAK is the central effort behind that. PEAK is intended to create certainty for the professional staff who work in the administrative functions so that they can gain focus, subject matter expertise, and new career paths. We are trying to eliminate the inefficiency of redundancy. It is not a layoff tool. In fact, as I've reported many times, we're really at historical lows for headcount in our administrative functions and elsewhere. If anything, as we work through the PEAK process, we are likely to hire rather than lay off. But we want to make sure we're hiring in ways that allow us to operate as productively as possible. So effective today, for example, we launched the first actionable pilot under PEAK. So we've been doing the planning and the consultation up to this point. And this pilot is for the staff who specialize in leave requests. So we now have a central team doing leave requests in the Office of Human Resources. All leaves already in progress will continue to be managed locally, but this is in response to our HR leads who said that this was a space where a combination of centralization or common processes would be most fruitful. As we work through each piece under the PEAK initiative, we'll think about which things should be common, which things should be custom, which things should be both. This isn't a wholesale centralization initiative, but it is an effort to ensure that administrative functions are offered consistently. And in many cases, that means we may have a different balance of common service or central service and custom service or unit level service. So lots of partnership with directors, managers, consultants, specialists, the 4 functional areas of focus: HR, finance, IT, marketing, comms. Very complex work, unsettling, I know. Change is never fun. but we need to do this. We need to make sure we are as productive and as efficient as possible. We owe it to the people who do this work. We owe it to ourselves to ensure that we are operating as efficiently as possible. And I really think, given the way that we're going through this, even if there are always, lessons to be learned along the way, that we will be a much better university and a much better place to work as a result of this effort. And I want to thank everyone who's been involved. I mean, there's a lot of people involved, but of course the chairs are Ken Horstman and Myron Franz, who have been leading this effort. So the last thing I want to offer to you in my report is that we have an upcoming Board of Regents meeting next week. It's really full agenda. November doesn't have a board meeting, and these months that come after an off month are often really full, and this is no exception. So we have mission fulfillment. We'll be offering the annual report on the strategic plan, which is now combined with the accountability report that we send to the legislature. We will have our collective bargaining agreements for the board to approve, which of course we're delighted by. We'll be bringing before the board our state capital request in anticipation of the next legislative session. Ken Horstman will be presenting our aggregated compensation and data metrics. The board will be selecting their new vice chair in light of Regent Sviggum's resignation from that position. That will be an interim selection, finishing Regent Sviggum's term until the summer of 2023, when the board will elect new chair and vice chair. I should also note for this body that during this upcoming legislative session, there are 4 board seats that will be elected, 3 districts and 1 of the at-large seats. That's a third of the board. So there's board activity. The board is also discussing potential changes to how they formally or by policy engage in public engagement. Our own Colleen Flaherty Manchester will be giving an update from the FCC/SCC. There will be a public safety update. And then, of course, whatever else comes along, as often is the case. And so it'll be quite full. And so with that, I will conclude my report. There were no questions submitted in advance, but I'm happy to answer questions from the floor. You want to queue up? Okay, thank you. And of course, if any of you marinate in that and want to reach out to me directly, you can anytime. And so with that, we'll move on to our next item, which is the provost report.
Thank you, President Gabel. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope your semesters are going well. We were very excited in my household with the first real snowfall. So hope you're all survived that too. I wanted to give you a quick update on some searches that we have going on, because President Gabel mentioned some of the ones on the administrative side. So as those of you might know, we have 4 dean searches active this year. The Dean of the Carlson School of Management, the Dean of the College of Biological Sciences, the Dean of the College of Design, and the relaunch search for the School of Public Health. So those are all at varying stages underway, and I'm happy to, some of them are in the public stage, some are in the private stage, but I'm happy to talk about whatever people would like to. In addition, I have 2 vice provost searches that have been announced, one for the vice provost for public engagement and one for the GPS, the international vice provost. And so if you have any suggestions of people who might be on search committees or nominations for those positions or input into those searches, I'd be delighted to hear it as well. I also wanted to offer a quick update on some topics that we had previously discussed. As you might remember, the Faculty Senate previously endorsed a recommendation around training for faculty for accommodations and universal design for learning. So that training is now in development. It's been beta tested. We're expecting to launch it this spring or maybe early summer to take effect in advance of the next academic year. As a reminder, we've got 3 20-minute modules, Everyone who's an instructor needs to complete this training once. So it's not an every year kind of thing, but it is something that everyone will need to do. We had also previously discussed instituting service awards, especially for faculty to recognize the work that individuals do at their departmental level. We have service awards for service at the university level, but this is explicitly to recognize department and college awards. We got some great feedback from FCC, and we now have a working group that's planning that implementation. That process would start in the spring in conjunction with the annual review process. And so the outcomes of the annual review process would feed into that award process, but we're making good progress on that side too. And then finally, at Faculty Senate, right after this meeting, we're going to be presenting and discussing recommendations from the Task Force on Faculty Behavior in Graduate Education. So as a reminder, this task force was formed at the bequest of COGS. It's generated a set of recommendations. Since these recommendations involve work that the faculty does, I'm seeking an endorsement from Faculty Senate on the broad recommendation so that we can move ahead with implementation through this fall and this spring. Finally, I'm sure that many of you were engaged in the discussions around commencement this year. I want to apologize again for the miscommunications in that rollout. And I want to assure you all, as I have assured our students, that while we are planning for one large conferral ceremony, actually two, one for graduates, one for undergraduates, every student will have an opportunity during other events to cross a stage and have their name read. We're working on the implementation plan for that. We hope to have something to present and discuss in January or February. But again, I apologize for miscommunication. We do want to make sure that we recognize our students who have put in so much through their college careers, and we will. So with that, I'll stop. I also didn't have any questions in advance, but I'm happy to hear of any.
Thank you, Provost Croson. Any questions for Rachel? Okay, thank you. Oh, whoops. Kathleen? No? Karen Sue? Oh, hold on one second, Karen Sue. Kathleen, we can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. Now I can, I'm
Sorry about
unmuted.
that.
I just wanted to ask Provost Croson, are we going to be using search firms for these dean positions, or are we going to be going on the inside?
Great question. We're using search firms for the 4 dean positions that I mentioned. The vice provost positions are more internal. We are accepting external candidates, of course, and I've had people asking me questions about the positions from outside the university, but we're not using search firms for those vice provost positions.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a good decision. Thank you for doing that and spending the money. It is extra, but I think it's good PR for the university as well as better candidates or more candidates. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kathleen. Sorry about that. Karen Sue?
Sure. So this is just an FYI to, I didn't get my hand up soon enough, President Gable, to make it to you, but I think it actually is relevant for both of you. I'm getting reports from faculty who are, I'm chair of my department, chair of anthropology and CLA, and I'm getting reports from faculty who are having technology problems in classrooms. And I had it happen to me yesterday where I could not get the camera to work. And when we call classroom management, they basically say, well, yesterday, actually, what they said directly to my TA was, well, we'll be there in 10 to 15 minutes, or we'll be there in 2 hours. And she said, can you tell me which one so we can figure out a plan for class? Because by the time she got off hold, class had already started. And they said, we don't provide that service. And so I don't read this as I'm not bringing this up as a critique of classroom management. I'm saying that there seems to be an infrastructure issue, that there is failure of technology in the classrooms. And that's a serious problem. And it really needs to be addressed quickly. That's all.
Well, thank you for passing that along. I'll follow up with the classroom management folks and see where we are. As you may know, we have some classrooms that are centrally supported. We have other classrooms that are controlled at the collegiate level. And so, I would need to know a little more detail about exactly which one and where it was and what the problem was. But I'll ask someone to reach out to you if that's all right, and we'll see if we can track it down.
Right. I'm less worried about me as an individual and more that I'm getting reports from my faculty. So it seems to be, and that they're hearing from other people who were in their classrooms that they've had this problem. And I'm seeing from somebody in the chat that it's happening in Carlson. My classrooms have been mostly in Blegan. So again, I'm thinking this is not, it's an infrastructure issue. I don't want classroom management to feel like they were called out as a problem. It seems to me it's a larger issue.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for the provost? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Rachel. All right, item 10 is the SCC report, and I'll call on Chair Professor Flaherty Manchester to give this report.
Thank you, President Gable. Members of the Senate, in the time since our last meeting, which doesn't feel like too long ago, I want to highlight the kind of 3 areas of effort by the SCC. So first, the SCC received a response from Regent Chair Ken Powell regarding the letter the SCC sent to the Board of Regents on October 28th that elevated the Code of Conduct governing board members as relevant to the comments made by Regent Spigum during the October 13th Board of Regents meeting, as well as kind of more generally for thinking about and guiding member behavior, or members of the board behavior. So in Chair Powell's response, he reaffirmed his commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion training of the board and its members. And so, at our SCC meeting, we discussed the response and had a deep discussion, I'd say, around this training, and raised questions about, thinking about how the board would assess the effectiveness of that training, and importantly, to what extent perhaps the university's own DE&I resources and education capabilities could be leveraged to contribute to that effort. So in my role as SCC chair, I've also been thinking about, with this experience, is this also an opportunity for the university to kind of spur ahead and become a leader in how we prepare our university leaders for their role in terms of their DE&I capabilities, and wondering to what extent the shared governance or the University Senate could contribute to that. So in my upcoming report to the Board of Regents that President Gable mentioned in her remarks, I give a report at the December meeting. I'll be mentioning the SCC's interest in the board's commitment to the training, raising the question about whether the university's own expertise could be leveraged in that pursuit. And again, thinking about how the university might use this opportunity to reflect and then lead in this area. Second, the SCC has been continuing to learn, ask questions, and understand PEAK and its kind of where it is at in its implementation, as well as the communication and feedback loops for that effort. So Senior Vice President Myron Franz and Vice President Ken Horstman spent time with the SCC on its November 21st meeting. Now, given the SCC draws from a variety of constituents, it's a really good group to kind of have this type of discussion, and we're eager to continue to learn more about PEAK as it rolls out. With the help of the Senate office, the consultative committee leaders were able to, proactively reach out to the PEAK Success Office and kind of start to have some additional communications to better understand the role of shared governance, to increase the likelihood of PEAK being successful at meeting its goals, as well as trying to, potentially mitigate any unintended consequences that the changes would have on staff, faculty, and students. And third, the SCC discussed and endorsed the changes that stemmed from the review of the governing documents of the Senate. So you'll hear later today in this meeting proposed changes in the governing documents that can be essentially divided into kind of a one substantive change, which has to do with special meeting provision, as well as codifying existing practices, for example, the 2-minute rule. So formal introduction and discussion of this item will take place later in the agenda. And that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. Are we doing Q&A on this, Colleen? Remind me. No, okay. Thank you. All right, so the next item concerns a motion we've received for revisions to the administrative policy on smoke and tobacco-free campus. These are minor revisions. No need for a second. We would open the floor to discussion. Any questions or discussion? Okay, Chris, if you could initiate the poll, we only need a simple majority to approve in this case.
We'll give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 125 ayes, 3 nays, and 18 abstentions, that motion does prevail.
Okay, thank you. Our next item is a discussion item regarding proposed revisions to the University Senate Constitution bylaws and rules. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Flaherty Manchester to present this item. Colleen.
Great. I believe Amber is going to share a screen. Okay, thank you. And thank you for your attention to this topic. So as I just mentioned in my report, we are going to be presenting to you some proposed changes to the governing documents of our Senate. And so next slide. In terms of the question of, why are we doing this? Well, first of all, it's been a long time since this happened. And second of all, we've heard feedback as well as we've undergone a lot of changes, particularly, for example, the meeting modality. So this effort actually started in 2019 with the University Senate office, and a work group was constituted, I should say, starting in 2021. Next slide. The working group, importantly, did a lot of effort on this, and it was also representative of each of the different Senate bodies because there was a lot of parallel aspects across the governing body documents. So today we're only going to be focusing on changes that are relevant to the University Senate, but these changes will also ripple through to proposed changes in the governing documents of the other Senates. Next slide. So the goal of this review was to update and revise the University Senate's governing documents. As I mentioned, it had been several decades since this has been done, and there's also been practices that we had been doing that needed to be codified. So the areas of focus were looking at language that was outdated, like I mentioned, codifying current practices or kind of modifying the language to make sure it aligns with our common practice, some grammatical changes, technical changes, looking to other institutions for best practices. We had feedback I received as well, and then also looking for kind of uniformity across the governing documents of the different Senates. Next slide. So for the review committee, they didn't look at every possible thing. In terms of the out of scope for this current review were the charges of the committees, which are in those governing documents, as well as membership or committee membership composition, so for the Senate or for the committee. So those two topics were not considered in this review. Next slide. So we're going to be proposing changes that affect the 3 governing documents of the University Senate. There's the Senate Constitution, the Senate bylaws, and the Senate rules. And just to preview, why am I mentioning these separately is because eventually when there is a vote at our next Senate meeting on these proposed changes, there's different thresholds for needed to have approval to change these documents. So that's why it's important to kind of lay out that there'll be changes in each of these different documents. So as I mentioned, this is focused on changes relevant to the University Senate. And the types of changes that we'll be talking about include kind of one, I would say, like substantive change, which is going to be the special meeting provision, which I'll talk about next. as well as codification of kind of current practices of our body, which Chris Kwapik is going to highlight and summarize. Next slide. All right, so the special meeting provision. So this is something that really came into the, I guess, the wheelhouse of the review committee, because we were actually experiencing questions and feedback from our senators about this provision. So just to help us understand kind of what we're talking about here. So we have 6 regular Senate meetings, 3 in the fall semester, 3 in the spring. And this question about special meetings is whether and how and who, more importantly, can call a special meeting outside of those regular meetings. And so currently, the way the documents are specified is that 10 members of the body can request a special meeting. And just to back up here, if you look at the diagram, we're trying to indicate, who has the ability to compel a meeting. So currently, we have the president and the SCC, and then indirectly members of the university senate. And again, 10 members can get together and make a request, and then that will go to the SCC, who would then decide whether to call a special meeting or not. So the proposed change is to actually make 3 different access points: the president, the SCC, and then a direct channel from membership of the university senate body to the ability to compel a special meeting. And so with that kind of change in protocol, we also need to have a threshold for that change. And so what we're proposing is a 10% threshold for the body, which is approximately 25 members. In addition, because the University Senate has members from the 4 different constituencies, the requirement would be that at least 2 members from each of the distinct constituencies would be part of that 25, right? So we need to have kind of representation from these different groups in order to have that lift of having a special meeting compelled. Next slide. So you might want to understand kind of how this proposed provision compares to our peers in terms of the Big Ten. So in terms of the dimension of compel versus request, 7 schools within the Big Ten have some type of compel provision from the Senate body, and 6 schools have a provision that links the Senate body as a request for a special meeting. And there's 1 school that doesn't allow members to do either, and it only comes through an executive committee. Next slide. So that previous slide was about the compel versus request. And then this slide is the different thresholds. So as I mentioned, the proposal is for a 10% threshold, which is approximately 25 members. If you look across our peers for the compel thresholds, the average threshold is around 18.5%. And what that means in terms of the schools is, 2 schools have 10% or lower threshold, 4 schools have 20% or higher thresholds, with 1 requiring 50%. And then if you think about thresholds for the different type of conduit, which is the request provision, the average threshold is slightly lower at 15.5%. So in total, the average provision threshold is about 17%. Next slide. So this is where I think I'm turning it over to Chris.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chair Manchester. So I'm just going to go over really quickly some of the notable changes from the Constitution, bylaws, and rules that we are proposing in addition to what the chair just mentioned about the special meeting provision. Within the Constitution, there's one area where we're going to be clarifying the powers of the University Senate to allow the Senate to offer advice on a variety of issues. This is something the Senate already does, but technically within the Constitution, I believe it only allowed for the University Senate to talk about academic policy, budget, and research. But clearly, the University Senate and its entire governance body talks about a number of different areas that are important to the university. So we're clarifying areas in that. Within the bylaws, some major or more notable changes include allowing for the vice chair, so this year is Professor Kristen Hickman, to provide over meetings more at will. In the previous rendition, the vice chair would take over if the president was only absent, but we realize that there are times when it could be inappropriate for the president to chair a meeting or perhaps a conflict of interest, and we wanted to create the ability to have a little bit more flexibility there. We also redefined the eligibility of some of the memberships, broadened some conflict of interest protections. And we also just clarified the process for the removals of members of committees. This was already there. This isn't a real big change, but basically because we have so many different types of members, from student members to faculty members, retiree members, alumni members, we wanted to just clarify the process by which that would go through, even though it really does not happen all that often. Next slide, please. Within the rules, one that I think you will all appreciate is the fact that we are going to permanently change the speaking time limit so that we don't have to make that motion every meeting from 3 minutes to 2 minutes. So that is probably one of the most notable things that you'll actually notice. But we've also added language that just clarifies that our meetings and voting can take place via an electronic means. Obviously, when we started this in 2019, we were not meeting via Zoom, although some of our system campuses would connect via electronic means, but basically just codifying the fact that we do meet in a more electronic world now. And so we're just making sure that that is reflected within those rules. And then finally, we have just some changes to how to reconsider motions, especially within committees, which again doesn't happen all that often, but this aligns a little bit more better with Robert's Rules of Order. And then you'll just notice that throughout the entire process, we are just making changes that are more technical or clarifying. Many of them are reflecting the different names of offices, administrative units, or the names of policies and things like that, just making sure that we're cleaning that up as best that we can, and then applying all of those changes, not just to the University Senate changes that are being presented before you, but also to the other constitutions, bylaws, and rules for the other senates as well. Next slide, please. So as Chair Manchester alluded to at the beginning of her presentation, these are all going to be presented in sort of different motions and different amendments. That the reason for that is because there are different thresholds of voting for the approval of changes to the Constitution, to the bylaws, and the rules. So as you can see here, it gets more difficult as we move up the chain from rules to Constitution to actually make changes. That's important, a very important thing to have, to make sure that you're not just making random changes willy-nilly, but that you're actually giving very considerate thought, which we've definitely tried to do throughout this entire process. Next slide. So I think I'm turning it back to you, Colleen.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, so today we are going to be opening up the discussion for these proposed changes. So there's going to be obviously opportunity for senators to ask questions, to comment, provide feedback on these proposed changes. And also we're trying to use this time to kind of inform the body about these changes, given that we will be voting on these in the next meeting, which takes place in February. So in terms of, comments and feedbacks, the SCC will be taking in that feedback as this item will come back to the SCC prior to going on the agenda for February 2023 University Senate. And as mentioned, proposed changes would be coming later for the governing documents of the other individual senates, but we felt it's important to have this start at the University Senate. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point, if you just want to queue up to make a comment, ask a question, make an observation. Okay, Scott, hi. You are still mute. There you go.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, the process takes a minute. So thank you very much. And I really just want to start by saying thank you to Chris, Colleen, and SCC and everybody for working really hard on this. I think the changes look really great. And they definitely move this body forward in a very positive way. The one comment I would have is not necessarily on the bylaws, but about the practice and implementation of these meetings that we're hosting in Zoom. I think just a small change to change the chat feature so that if people have point of orders, motions, and those sorts of things to bring up as part of the body, if you change the chat to be a chat to all hosts at the same time, it adds kind of a layer of transparency and helps you operationally manage these meetings. Because if Chris is busy trying to manage the queue, Colleen is talking, it allows someone else to see the motion or the point of order that may be called by a senator in the body, as opposed to asking all of us senators to individually message everyone to try to make sure that that point of order is heard in the right procedural way. So, thank you.
Chris, did you want to respond?
Yep, thank you, Scott, for that suggestion. And actually, I believe we do have that. I know that we technically have it on the intro slide that it should come to me, but I think we can make that adjustment as well. So I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
Adam Sichla, graduate student senator and vice chair of the Student Senate. I'll echo Scott's suggestion. I know Chris said that it's possible, so I'm happy about that. But the other broadly, I think all the suggestions make sense within these. The one I'd like to push on is around the requirements for a special session, and would generally advocate for a lower number than 10%. I'm quite happy with the 10, or make it where it's represented at least 2 members from 2 different senates, not necessarily 2 members of each senate. Sometimes there can be things that should go to the whole Senate, but are really pushed forward by one of the particular subgroups that need to go to everyone. So it would help make things a bit more streamlined, especially since people don't really push for special meetings very often. It's pretty much only when it's absolutely necessary. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Adam. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, thank you all very much. And thank you to everyone who's been working on this. And I agree. I think this is really good progress. So with that, we'll move on to the next item, which is old business. There is no old business for the University Senate. Item 14 is new business. Please note that any new business will be referred to committee unless special permission is granted by 2/3 of those voting and present. Is there any new business? All right, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Is anyone willing to make such a motion? Okay, and Rachna, you're the second, just so you know. All right, Chris, can you launch the poll on the motion to adjourn?
We'll give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 154 ayes, no nays, and 2 abstentions, that motion prevails.
Okay, Thank you all very much. We are adjourned. Faculty Senate will convene at 3:50 in the same Zoom room. So thank you all very much. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to call to order the Faculty Senate. I'd like to start by saying that this is a meeting of the Faculty Senate, and while non-faculty senators are welcome to attend this meeting, only faculty senators may introduce business and vote on matters considered at this meeting. The floor is reserved for faculty senators, but others, of course, may have the floor if yielded time by a faculty senator and recognized by the chair. So with that, we will start with our motion to approve a special rule limiting each speaker to 2 minutes each time they're recognized. A 2/3 majority is required to approve the special rule. No motion or second are needed. So is there any discussion? Seeing none, Chris, could you launch the poll?
I'll give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 84 ayes, 2 nays, and 1 abstention, that motion prevails.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Item 3 concerns administrative responses to Faculty Senate actions and is presented for information. Item 4 is approval of minutes from the Faculty Senate meeting of November 3rd, 2022. No motion or second needed. We'll just initiate the poll. Chris?
We'll give about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 80 ayes, 0 nays, and 6 abstentions, that motion prevails.
Right, thank you. Next item is the FCC report, and I'll call on Professor Flaherty Manchester to give this report. Colleen?
Thank you, President Gable. So in the short time since our last Faculty Senate meeting, the FCC has continued its efforts to elevate the importance of faculty reinvestment at the university. In the span of approximately a month, the FCC or the FCC leadership will have multiple opportunities to interact with members of the Board of Regents. So the committee sees this as key opportunities to increase awareness by members of the board as to the experiences and perspectives of faculty and why faculty engagement matters for mission delivery. So in particular, on November 17th, the Board of Regents Chair Ken Powell spent an hour with the FCC, and during this time, we made progress on understanding the perspectives of the board members and identified an opportunity to better communicate the key link between faculty engagement and student success, which is a leading priority of many board members and also a first pillar in the Impact 2025 strategic plan. So in my upcoming report to the Board of Regents in December, in their December meeting, I should say, I'll highlight the same FCC priorities I shared with you all in our September Senate meeting, and I will emphasize the perspective on faculty reinvestment. Importantly, that need really was manifest in the listening sessions that the FCC helped host throughout the calendar year 2022, including a town hall of senators, a faculty forum, and then a survey sent to faculty senators this past summer. So in particular, I want to build off that connection between faculty engagement and student success in my comments to the board, and then try and really kind of present this concept of faculty reinvestment as really an investment in the university's strategic plan, given that connection with student success. In my comments, I'll also elevate the importance of what the FCC is calling the 3 R's, which are recruiting, rewarding, and retaining faculty and staff. So we often hear about the recruiting and the retention piece, and there's actually mention of these dimensions in the Impact 2025 strategic plan, but we're also trying to elevate that rewarding piece, in particular, kind of recognizing the ongoing contributions of faculty and staff who are dedicated to advancing the university's mission. So the FCC will continue to work to elevate this priority of faculty reinvestment. as it fulfills its consultative charge, engaging with administration and coordinating with other faculty Senate committees in its steering capacity. So we're also looking to work across Senates on elevating the kind of overall priority of human capital investment. In the course of the FCC's work in the last month, in terms of its consultative charge, we also provided input to Executive Vice President and Provost Croson about the proposed focus on student mental health as part of the Higher Learning Commission accreditation. We also heard from Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Education, Scott Lanyon, about the task force recommendations that came from the task force on faculty behavior in graduate education. And this will be a topic that we'll be returning to later on the agenda. So that's my report from the FCC on its recent activities. As a reminder, to facilitate communication between the senators and the FCC, we've added questions for the FCC chair as part of the agenda for the year. I see this as a direct opportunity for listening for myself and for the committee. And so for the questions asked, I'll do my best to try to answer them during the meeting. And if I'm not able to, I'll gather the information I need and respond to you outside the meeting. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, President Gable, but then we'll go to questions.
Yes, so thank you very much for that report and for the work that it represents. So I will open the floor for questions for the FCC chair. Okay, well, thank you for making yourself available. We'll go to the next item. So the next item is recommendations from the Provost Task Force on Faculty Behavior in Graduate Education. I'm going to call, excuse me, on the Provost to kick off this presentation. So Rachel.
Great. Thank you, President Gable. And Amber, maybe we can put the slides up. Awesome. Thank you. So you can go to the next slide. So today I want to talk a little bit about the task force itself, kind of how it came to be, the charge, who was on it. The task force has now submitted a set of recommendations to me, which is what I'm sort of soliciting from Faculty Senate, soliciting input from Faculty Senate. As you'll see, we've talked to a number of other bodies as well, and then we'll have a discussion. I'm going to ask for an endorsement of these 5 recommendations at the next Faculty Senate meeting. So this is really the discussion phase, and that will enable us to begin implementation. So you go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, in spring 2021, the Council of Graduate Students asked me to establish a task force to make recommendations to improve interactions between graduate students and faculty, and to hold faculty accountable for unprofessional behavior toward graduate students. I should add that there was quite a lot of discussion at the time about the distinction between relationships between faculty and graduate students and relationships between graduate students and advisors. And COGS was quite clear that while the advisor-student relationship was pivotally important and an important subset of this, they really wanted this report to focus on all faculty and all students rather than just the student-advisor relationship. You can go to the next slide. So after some consultation, we created a task force as requested. Phil Bowman chaired the task force. He's here as well, along with Scott Lanyon, who served on the task force. As you can see, we had a representation from postdocs. We had a number of graduate students on the task force, and we have a set of people who had been involved in this space already, like Jan Morse, the director of the Dignity Project, and Yoji Shimizu, who had worked in this area for the graduate school itself. You want the next slide? And so what I asked this task force to do, based on the guidance and the request from COGS, was to evaluate the ongoing efforts to improve the experience of graduate students and postdocs while they're with us, to report on the prevalence and impact of this unprofessional behavior, which we've heard about, of course, anecdotally, but we don't have a lot of formal evidence for or against, and to make recommendations aimed at eradicating both abuses of power and maybe more mild types of unprofessional behavior. You go ahead to the next slide. So the group talked to many different, the task force talked to many different groups, both formal governance like SCEP and AF&T, administrative like the Council of Research Associate Deans, the Academy of Distinguished Teachers, the Community of Scholars programs. There were a lot of different avenues that they went to get their input. You can go ahead on the next slide. And so just a little reminder of the timeline, and then I'm going to hand it over to Scott. So the request for the task force happened in the spring, which we did. The task force did their work over the last academic year. They delivered a set of recommendations to me, which is what I'm now asking for you to either endorse or disagree with. So this semester, we've been sharing that task force report. We shared it with FCC and had a good discussion there. We shared it with COGS itself, had a good discussion there. I think we shared it with the Student Senate recently. And so the next step is to form an advisory group to help develop proposals for actual implementation. And presuming that you all endorse these 5 broad recommendations, we would plan to come back to you in the spring to share the recommendations from those advisory groups and more detail on implementation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thanks very much. To start off, I think it's just sort of good to use our Grad Cero survey that we do every other year to sort of see where we're at as an institution. And I think it's important to always acknowledge that, in fact, the majority of our graduate students are actually very happy with their relationship with their advisor. I'm just talking about the advisor at the moment because that's what Grad Cero asked about. About 90% of respondents said that they would recommend their advisor to another student. However, Grad Cero also indicates that a little bit less than 6% of respondents said that they would definitely not recommend their advisor to other students. So this gives us an idea of perhaps the magnitude of the sort of the most negative interactions, the frequency of the most negative interactions between graduate students and their advisors. This information is obviously about that advisor-advisee relationship. And the task force really, as the provost mentioned, focused on behavior broadly in graduate education. And to that point, the surveys that were conducted by the Student Conflict Resolution Center actually indicate that twice as many students report that they're experiencing harassment from faculty other than their advisor than experience it from their advisor. So this is definitely an issue that's a little bit broader than this 5.7% might suggest. And note too, and again, the provost, indicated that this was the case. The breadth of this task force charge was not only to make recommendations about how to hold faculty accountable if they engage in serious unprofessional behavior, but also to make recommendations to help all graduate faculty to be as effective as possible in their contributions to graduate education. Can I have the next slide? So I'm just going to run through these recommendations briefly. The first is really to establish clear expectations for everybody in this graduate education community, the graduate school, colleges, grad programs, academic departments, faculty, advisors, and so on, and students as well. We know, again, from the Student Conflict Resolution Center, that, and our conversation with graduate students, postdocs, staff, and faculty, the vast majority of instances in which there's a strained or even toxic relationship between faculty and graduate students, it really stems from, at its heart, poor communication of expectations. It's difficult for students, postdocs, and faculty to meet expectations if they're unaware of them. So for example, faculty, let me give you this sort of scenario. Imagine a faculty in a graduate program, typically, the majority of faculty meet with their advisees every semester to provide feedback on their progress. But one faculty member fails to do that fails to have those regular meetings. And that faculty member's advisees, therefore, are seriously stressed because they're not getting regular feedback. The problem is the faculty member didn't know that that was actually the expectation of the program because no one had communicated it to them. And yet the student had the expectation based on interactions with other students. This is an example of where we really need to help faculty by being much more transparent about expectations of faculty. Or consider the situation where a student provides a faculty member with a draft of a dissertation chapter, and the faculty member returns that comments about a month later. The student is really unhappy. They were really expecting a faster turnaround, and now their defense might be delayed significantly. And the problem wasn't that it took a month to receive feedback. The problem was that the faculty member hadn't communicated that they were going to be really busy for those months, maybe even traveling. And as a result, the student's progress is seriously impacted. Everybody's unhappy based on very poor communication. And so the task force concluded that if everyone involved in graduate education communicated more clearly, that stress on students, faculty, and staff could be reduced significantly. Next slide. The second recommendation is to develop clear guidelines and procedures to articulate and reinforce these expectations for professional behavior. Faculty behavior in graduate education is frankly based largely on what we experienced when we were graduate students. We're replicating what we learned, okay? Unfortunately, what we experienced was both many years ago and not necessarily ideal. And so what we consider to be professional behavior has evolved, and it's relatively rare that faculty are told what's expected of them today in their role as graduate faculty. The task force heard from many sources that as an institution, we need to be proactive in educating faculty and graduate students about what is considered to be professional behavior and what's considered to be inappropriate. And that this needs to be communicated not only by the institution, but also by colleges and programs, because, well, it seems likely that we could agree on a series of behaviors that would be considered inappropriate for all disciplines. There are certainly disciplines and disciplinary differences in how faculty interact with graduate students, and some behaviors might be considered appropriate in one discipline and not in another. So, for example, in some STEM disciplines, it's occasionally necessary for graduate students to be involved in research that occurs well after normal working hours. Such disciplines would consider that totally appropriate behavior, as long as the possibility of such late work was clearly communicated to students and that it's not an everyday thing, that it's an occasional event. But in other disciplines, a faculty member requiring a graduate student to work until midnight would simply be considered inappropriate. So we're going to need to have these discussions at multiple levels within the organization. Next slide. Third recommendation is to establish clear mechanisms for reporting, talking with people about bad behavior, investigating instances of unacceptable behavior, and intervening or imposing sanctions when faculty engage in such behaviors. The task force heard repeatedly that students and postdocs were unclear about what they should do if they experience bad behavior. And then we heard from faculty, department heads, directors of graduate studies, associate deans, that they were uncertain what their role was in responding to this if they do hear about this behavior. Now, my grad school colleagues and I have been thinking further about these recommendations, and we believe that it's going to be important for the institution, colleges, and programs to actually categorize what we mean by unacceptable behaviors and to basically categorize that into two buckets. Behaviors that have negative consequences for graduate students or postdocs, but which are not really egregious and therefore which can be corrected, they're correctable. And then separately, behaviors that we might consider egregious. The non-egregious behaviors are the most common. These are, for these behaviors, students and postdocs, they don't really want a big confrontation over these, big investigation. What they want is for the behavior to simply stop, right? And to address these kinds of behaviors, the task force concluded that students and postdocs need to know who they should talk to, another faculty member, a mentor, department head, DGS, whatever, if they experience one of these behaviors. And the person to whom they're reporting this, talking to about this, need to know how to respond, how to intervene, to remind the faculty member that this behavior is considered inappropriate, and to offer suggestions on how to do better in the future. The egregious behaviors, while not common, have enormous impact on students and postdocs. And we have to ensure, the task force concluded that we have to ensure as an institution that we have in place procedures for investigating allegations of egregious behavior, imposing sanctions where appropriate, and of course, having a grievance process to go with that. Note that while this division of unacceptable behaviors into non-egregious or egregious has not yet been made, that's something that we would do as we move forward with implementation. One thing that we've realized is that if a faculty member repeatedly engages in what we might consider non-egregious behaviors and refuses to correct that behavior, that qualifies eventually as being egregious in and of itself. Next slide. The fourth recommendation, not surprisingly, is that if we do all those first three recommendations successfully, we're going to have a good program of really informing everyone in the graduate education community about these innovations, because we're trying to change culture here. And so that's going to be a big part of this, is making sure that faculty, staff, students are aware of these issues. Again, all of this is leading to more transparency. Next slide. And the fifth and final recommendation is to form a team to actually look into implementing these. This is complex work. The reason progress in many ways has been slower than we might like in this space, not just at the University of Minnesota, but in all higher ed institutions, that this is really complicated. Improving the relationship between faculty and students and postdocs is going to require a collaborative effort of departments, colleges, central offices, and governance. Therefore, this final recommendation is to pull together a group who can actually oversee and come up with ideas about how to implement and bring together the various voices, the various individuals who will need to cooperate and collaborate. Now, in closing, it's important to note that one of the reasons that this is so complicated to deal with is that graduate education at the University of Minnesota has been and is today very successful, right? As we go forward, we don't want to damage what's working for the vast majority of our students, but we mustn't ignore the fact that we know that we could do better. And we certainly want to improve our ability to respond in those rare instances in which faculty have behaved pretty badly, so badly that the faculty member themselves is the major barrier preventing a student or postdoc from realizing their academic dreams. So we have actually started this last group here, to form an advisory group to start exploring what this might look like if we implement these things. Their charge is to keep in mind that we want to preserve what's working in graduate education and working well. We want to help faculty to be as effective as possible in their role as graduate faculty and postdoctoral advisors. And we want to be able to hold faculty accountable if they insist on engaging in behaviors that are damaging to graduate students or postdoctoral scholars. Next slide. So with that, we're here, we wanted to present this. We wanted to simply ask, are we on the right track? Are these the right issues to work on? We'd love to hear your feedback. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, President Gabel.
Thank you, Scott. I'm gonna call on a couple of people before we open the floor. First, I'll call on Phil Bowman.
Thank you, President Gabel. So I just quickly wanted to emphasize how lucky I feel that I was able to chair that task force, because I think it's a really good purpose. And as we did a lot of consultation, as Provost Croson has emphasized, we talked to a lot of faculty as well. And one thing we really heard was how faculty are proud about this institution, how they want to make it a good-looking institution. And also for all of those of us who do recruit graduate students, also actually how important it is that we do give a good impression to the outside. And in that context, I think it's important to emphasize that the task force also really try to understand what is going on at other institutions in regard to this particular topic. And what we have learned certainly is that if we're going to really have a comprehensive look at this problem that was just outlined, we are going to be a leader in the nation. And I think that's another thing we should be proud of. And finally, the last thing I do want to kind of emphasize too is that if in the next or upcoming faculty Senate, there will be a vote about this. The vote really will be about the outline, about the general recommendations that are being made by the task force. Clearly, it will take 3 years, presumably, to really come up with the details. And a lot of the devil is in the details in many cases. And so this faculty senate will not be asked really to vote about all those details. They will have opportunities again. There will be a lot of consultation again in the future. The question really is about does the faculty senate really support that we engage in this topic and follow these 5 kind of general guidelines that the task force has been suggesting. With that, back to President Gable.
Thank you, Phil. And then next I'm going to ask Pavan Gutipati to speak, but I'll note, since he is not a member of the Faculty Senate, that Mark B has yielded his time in order to allow us to hear the student perspective. So Pavan.
All right, thank you, President Gable. Hi, everyone. My name is Pavan Gutipati. I'm the chair of the Student Senate. I am an undergrad, but as was mentioned previously, there was a presentation regarding this just a couple hours ago to the Student Senate, and so I can speak on behalf of what my other peers were talking about and had the comments on regarding this proposal. Overall, the comments that I've heard about and my personal views that we are all in support of this proposal overall. We believe that this is a good step forward in creating guidelines and making sure that there are sort of a framework to approach these scenarios and clearly put us ahead of the curve regarding other institutions. So I think it's a really good idea. I'm looking forward to seeing how things are actually implemented, which is, again, the devil's in the details and things are actually implemented. So I'm looking forward to further consultation with grad students and students overall as we move forward, but I'm generally in support of this.
Thank you, Pavan. Okay, so I'll take the questions, and in the queue, we have 2 hands raised. And so Will, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a comment and just 2 questions. I mean, I just, to start, this is really important. And in my experiences as director of graduate studies in history, one of the things that we found was that students often had sort of what I think might be classified as non-egregious issues, but that sort of built up over time. And it was difficult for students to actually identify when they became egregious. And so they often did that very late and very often sort of after the fact. And so we actually went through a lot of process of trying to clarify expectations. These were often around sort of work relationships between students and faculty. And we found that clarifying the expectations allowed students to realize much more quickly when they had to sort of take action, and also spelling out how you take action and who you can bring complaints to. But just doing that made it sort of facilitated the process of raising these issues. So I think this is the right approach. I guess my 2 questions are about, I mean, the language of in Scott Lanyon's presentation was the recommendations were all about student advisor relations. And that seemed to contradict the request from COGS to make this about all student faculty relationships. And it just seems important to me in the promoting and the discussion around this to clarify that and be clear that this is not just about student advisor relationships. I'm also wondering just finally about the language of egregious versus non-egregious. And it seems to me that opens the possibility of when a student brings something that might not be like terrible, but is a problem to them, labeling it non-egregious seems to discount the problem. And I wonder if it's it might be better to use language around sort of an immediate or a long-term threat, but not some language that doesn't sort of suggest that something's not important. But thanks for your work on this.
Thank you, Will. Eric?
Hey, everyone, thanks. Yeah, so I'm chair of AF&T. So I guess AF&T, we talked about this a little bit, and we're pretty supportive of a lot of the ideas here, right? Especially how to communicate to faculty and students about these things, so everybody sort of is working from the same set of expectations. But we were a little concerned that some of the consultations seemed to happen kind of early in the process, and that there were parts of the recommendations now that it's finalized that some of the committee members had some concerns about. So we're sort of hoping we're a little more engaged in like the implementation phase in some way, so that we can, our job, we are supportive of a lot of these things, of course, but our job is to kind of, maintain and pay attention to the tenure code and faculty academic freedom issues. And, one thing that caught our eye, I guess, was this part in section 6 about graduate faculty status possibly being revoked by the graduate college. And that was one that was sort of popped up as a kind of a non-starter from our perspective, that these sort of big decisions are ones that really belong at the faculty unit level and not sort of administrator decisions. So it's like I said, I think generally there's a lot of great stuff in here. It's sort of just a request, I guess, that we're more engaged in the next phase of this, so that some of those concerns that that committee works on get a little more airing. So but thanks again.
Anything more from our presenters? Move on to Okay, thank you all very much. Look forward to the next round on all of this. All right, next item is a listening session for the FCC on internal communications. I'll turn it over to the FCC chair, Professor Flaherty Manchester, for this item. Colleen?
Thank you, President Gable. So I just want to provide a little bit of background before we open up the listening session. So this is the listening session for internal communication pertaining to labor negotiations. So the FCC, as part of its charge, is to receive from faculty members any notification of concerns that would require consultation with the president or senior academic officers. And in October, the FCC leadership received notifications from about 24 faculty expressing concerns, about 2 emails sent to the university community pertaining to the negotiations with the Teamsters. The input received included concerns of one-sided messaging on this internal conflict affecting our community, asymmetry in the information channels available to the negotiating parties, and then the emphasis placed on legal guardrails as opposed to also incorporating more of a values approach in the communication. So in response to these notifications, the FCC leadership had a special meeting. It was on October 19th. And at that meeting, the FCC members kind of affirmed the understanding that shared governance is not going to be weighing in on the specifics of the ongoing labor negotiations at the time. But we agreed that concerns voiced about the internal communications on those negotiations were in the purview and pertinent to the FCC's duties and responsibilities. So at that meeting, the FCC voted to directly raise the issue of concern to the administration. In addition, the committee also viewed it as relevant topic for discussion within the faculty senate in order to hear from faculty senators. And so the committee added this item to the agenda for today. So just to kind of summarize, the FCC is interested in hearing any questions, comments, or concerns, including from those we've heard, as well as those we have not yet heard on the topic of internal communications pertaining to labor negotiations. This session will inform the FCC's feedback to the administration. And in addition, just being transparent, in our special meeting that I referred to, the FCC had a kind of split vote on whether to take what I would call more formal action, which would be a letter, a resolution, or a statement. And so this listening session would also inform any further consideration of formal action by the committee. So with that, I'll be moderating the queue in terms of individuals wanting to share their perspectives. Okay, looks like we have Karen Sue Tessick.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I was really upset about the messaging that we got. And I do think that the university needs to be more careful about how it exercises control over the means of communication. Yeah, I mean, I think that is just a really huge issue, that it is very hard for people, in this case, low-level staff, to be able to communicate to the broader university community. And so there's real disparities in terms of, there's just unequal access to being able to have conversations. And I did think that the university abused that in this case. We also had a lot of graduate students who were really scared by the messaging. I had graduate students in tears. So I think it was really quite an unfortunate situation. And I personally was really, really troubled by it.
Thank you, Karen, for sharing that. Next person is John Budd.
Thanks, Colleen. Yeah, I'm John Budd, faculty senator in the Carlson School of Management. And yeah, I have a similar reaction. First, I want to thank the FCC for taking up this issue. I think it's an important step towards faculty being stronger allies with staff. Yeah, like Karen before me, I was really troubled by the messages that we received. It was sort of couched as just administration filling in gaps in our knowledge. And I think we really need to see it as really the exercise of institutional power, and need to recognize, as the previous speaker was noting, the asymmetry and access to those channels of communication, and really see it through that lens. The other thing I'd add is that we've all been asked over the last couple of years to reflect on our own practices and really strive to do much better in terms of inclusion and equity and also allyship. And I hope the administration is engaging in the same reflection of their own policies and practices. And what I've seen in this context suggests that they're not, and really not, it doesn't really seem consistent with being on a path towards being a truly equitable and inclusive institution. So I support the FCC engaging with the administration in ways that they would find most impactful.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? Yeah, Sheer.
Hi, thank you. I just want to add that I also share my colleagues' concerns that have been just right now expressed about the language of these communications that honestly read as a little bit intimidating even, I would say. And I was wondering if you could also say something about the deliberations that the FCC had about you mentioned a sort of split vote on whether or not there would be any formal action taken, and I was just wondering if you can say what the split was about, because I do think that it's important that the FCC would continue to engage with this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question and the comment. So the FCC, the majority voted in favor of taking what we labeled as informal action, which would be kind of fulfilling our consultative role of the advising the administration and putting forth this concerns that we heard. The split vote came from whether the FCC would author a formal legislative action that would be a letter, a statement, or a resolution. So that's where I guess the question, or why my assessment of those two different votes was related to which action we thought was going to be the most kind of effective at getting the concern across. And so I think members of the committee were confident that informal action, or many members were confident that informal action would be effective, and then it was split on whether formal action would be needed. If that answers your question. Karen? Is that a new hand?
It is, sorry, I figured since nobody else had their hand up, I'd come back and say something more, which is, I was one of the signatories on a letter that went to to the FCC and to others from CLA chairs. And I just want to call attention to the fact that a lot of CLA chairs are not members of the Faculty Senate, but I do think it's important for the Faculty Senate to know that, I think at least 2/3 of the chairs of the College of Liberal Arts were really upset about this, and we're hearing from their faculty and graduate students. So those of us who were in leadership positions, I think, heard a lot from people about how upset they were about this issue.
And Karen, can I ask a follow-up question about, and who was that letter addressed to? Was it addressed, who received that letter, I guess?
So I think it went to the FCC. It went to President Gabel. I can't remember who it all went to.
Okay, I just want to make sure it was if I want to just understand if the multitude of audiences and kind of whether that message was likely received or not.
I think we put in I think it was sent by email, so you could see from the email who else got it.
Yeah, I can go back. Thank you.
Yeah.
Will?
I'm on the FCC, so I don't know if it's appropriate for me to be weighing in on this. But I just wanted to ask a few clarifying questions about one about this letter, if there was any response to the letter, and also to the FCC chairs and co-chairs conversation. Did you bring this? You brought this to the president, and so President Gabel, maybe you could respond, or Colleen, you could tell us what kind of response you got. I guess I'm wondering. It seems to me that, my concern about this, and I was also concerned about this, is largely around the distinction between an HR memo that went sort of to everybody on the campus, sort of informing us about the possibility of a strike and how it might affect our work, which seems completely appropriate for HR to be sending out. Most of the memos that went out leading up to the strike, I think, did that, were mostly that kind of message. But there was one that was particularly, and this is the one that generated a lot of the attention, that took a very clear side on the strike itself and on the conflict, to the point of saying the university is a great employer, suggesting that the negotiations were that the union was not negotiating in good faith, and suggesting that the complaints of the union members were not legitimate. And that seemed to me to be where this messaging crossed the line into, taking into partisanship. And I guess I'm wondering if maybe President Gabel wants to respond to this, but is there a clear policy on sort of what are the types of messages that are appropriate to go out to the entire university community through that type of messaging?
Thanks, Will. I will be moderating this session in terms of the questions and the listening. So, I think your question was, how was the initial concerns received? And so at the time it was kind of in the negotiation, I understood that the message was, acknowledged and received. And I think it was still in the ongoing negotiations. And I have not yet had an opportunity to speak directly with Ken Horstman about this, as I was waiting to kind of hear from any additional feedback from this listening session today to kind of hone that message. So that's part of that informal action hasn't been fully fulfilled, I would say, at this point. And I don't know if your earlier question was that to Karen Sue about whether she received a response from the letter. I didn't understand that first part of your comment.
Well, it was to, I mean, to you or to Karen Sue or to President Gable, whether there's been any response to that message.
Well, Ken Horstman sent a response initially. But I don't know how Karen's group received that in terms of if she felt it was satisfactory or not. Any other questions or comments?
I was just gonna say, since I wasn't the one who sent the letter, I'm not sure I saw a response. But our letter went out and right away there was the announcement that there was a likely agreement. So I think we felt like, well, at least that's happened. But I don't remember hearing about any follow-up, but there's been a lot on our plate. So it could be that things came across and I'm just not remembering.
Well, thank you for those senators who shared their perspectives. If anyone has a perspective they want to share with me via email, please feel free to do that. There will be space on the FCC agenda to discuss this listening session in our December 15th meeting. Okay, I think back to you, President Gable.
Okay, thank you, everybody. The next item concerns old business. There's no old business. The next item, item 10, concerns new business. Please note that any new business will be referred to committee unless special permission is granted by 2/3 of those present and voting. Is there any new business? Okay, seeing none, I will call for a motion to adjourn. Is there a motion? Rachna, is there a second? You all want to stay forever? Thank you, Perry. Any discussion? Okay, Chris, if you could initiate the poll.
You have about 10 more seconds if you wish to vote. And last call. There being 87 ayes, no nays, no abstentions, that motion prevails.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your leadership and work, and more soon. Enjoy the rest of your semester.